Well, I was planning on moving on in Malachi chapter 2 to verses 10 and following, but there was something in Malachi chapter 2, verses 8 through 9 that really jumped out at me that I could not skip over. So we're going to take today, focusing on verses 8 and 9 of Malachi chapter 2, and the two things that I want to really camp on are found in the title of the sermon, Lifting Up and Stumbling. And the meaning of those two things will become more apparent as I go this morning. But the particular parts of verses 8 and 9 that I want you to pay attention to, that I'm really going to hone in on, are in verse 8, we read, "You have caused many to stumble by your instruction." Some of you may have law there. I will explain the difference in a moment. Verse 9, "You do not keep my ways, but show partiality in instruction." And that translation of the instruction comes from the ESV. Notice the same word in both verses, instruction. And the connection between the two verses is, and those two parts of the two verses that I just read, is that these priests were causing people to stumble by their instruction. How? By showing partiality in their instruction. So because they showed partiality in their instruction, they caused people to stumble. Again, the word that's translated in the ESV, instruction, some of you may have law there. The reason why is because the word in the Hebrew is Torah. If you know anything about Judaism, they will refer to the first 5 books of the Bible as the Torah. Torah is often in the Old Testament means law, and it is the summary word used to sum up, again, the first 5 books of the Bible. But you have to understand that the Hebrew word Torah in the Old Testament can be used at times to mean something more broadly, like instruction or teaching. Now, let me give you an example of that. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8 reads, "Hear, my son, your father's training." That's a totally different word. And then the rest of the verse reads, "And do not forsake your mother's teaching." And the word there for teaching is Torah. It doesn't mean your mother's law, though a Jewish mother will, of course, teach her sons about God's law. But it's more emphasizing the issue of instructing your son that's being used there in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8. So Torah does not always mean law. Sometimes it's used more broadly to mean teaching or instruction, and that's the way the translators of the English Standard Version translate it multiple times in Malachi chapter 2, and I believe they got it right when you look at the context of Malachi chapter 2. It's talking about instruction more broadly that ought to be rooted in God's law, but it wasn't necessarily just God's law. In other words, there are many biblical subjects or topics that a pastor can teach on, like myself. And as I do so, there will be many things that I say that will point towards the subject that I'm talking about that aren't necessarily the subject itself. That's the idea. Instruction that points people towards God's law, but is not necessarily God's law. And so these priests were failing because they were to be doing that, but they weren't. They were perverting God's law by perverting their instruction. And no one can do this without consequences according to God. Today, we have more than God's law. We have the Old Testament and the New Testament. We have the entire Bible. And so that only compounds the danger. And the warning, application of what's here in Malachi chapter 2, verses 8 through 9. No one can show partiality in their instruction from God's word without harming others. Now, some of you may be wondering why is your sermon entitled Lifting Up and Stumbling? The reason why is because in verse 9, where your translation says something about partiality, you are showing partiality. In the Hebrew, it literally means you are lifting up faces in your instruction. You are lifting up faces in your instruction. Now, of course, we don't talk that way today, but that was a Hebrew idiom, which basically meant showing partiality, showing favor. In fact, this word is actually used in the Old Testament of God refusing to do this. In Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 17, the same exact language is found, and it literally means God does not lift up faces and God does not take bribes. That's Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 17. So the meaning behind the Hebrew idiom is that of elevating a person or persons in how you treat them, elevating them in how you treat them. And so when it comes to God's word, the warning is this. Please listen. The warning is this: we can elevate a person or people to a place that they do not belong in relation to God's word. In other words, we are, in a sense, if we pervert the instruction that comes from God's word, we are placing them above God's word in how we supposedly instruct them from God's word. So the meaning is there is something in our instruction that supposedly comes from God's word that rather than elevating God's word, elevates a person or people above God's word. And it's sad to say, but it is true. I'll give you a brief historical illustration of this from history that maybe helps solidify the meaning. Some of the old churches, like in European countries, you may even find it in some Presbyterian churches today, but this isn't done as much anymore. If you go back to the time of the Reformers, the Puritans, you're going to find this almost in every church. What you would find in those churches is they would have an elevated podium area, of course, but they would have a very high and lifted up pulpit. In fact, in some of those churches, the pulpit would be so high and lifted up, you actually had to walk up steps to get into the pulpit and stand in a position like this, like I am doing right now. Why did they do that? They didn't do it because they were elevating the man. They were doing it because they actually believed that we are to elevate, lift high God's word, what it teaches, what it means, above all of us. That was the meaning and the reasoning behind why they did that in history. And sadly to say, we don't do that much anymore. Maybe most people don't even realize why that was done, but that is the reason why it was done. And I believe that was a very good reason. So how can we do this? How do we lift people up above God's word? It's very simple. Instead of telling them the straight truth from the Bible and instructing them with it, we bend it a little bit. We twist it a little bit, or maybe a lot, to accommodate them, rather than fearing God and His truth and His word and teaching it in a straightforward yet loving but bold manner and letting the chips fall where they may. That's how we do it. That's how the priests were doing it. Remember the context for what we're in Malachi chapter 2? They were telling people, hey, it's okay to bring your defiled sacrifices. They knew very well from God's law that God said, I will not accept them. Over and over again, the Old Testament, God says, bring me your best. Don't bring me your leftovers. Don't bring me your defected sacrifices. Don't bring me your defiled sacrifices. These priests were telling people the complete opposite. What were they doing? They were lifting up people, above God's word and their instruction, thereby perverting it. This is massively relevant. Massively relevant in every single generation. Why? Because I can tell you from experience, I can tell you from my life of studying pastors and their sermons and sermons themselves. This is the nerdy part of me. I listen. I don't just listen. I don't like listening to my sermons. I listen to my sermons to find my mistakes so I can get better. But I listen to many other sermons by many other pastors, both nationwide and locally and et cetera and so on. And I could tell you from experience, I can tell you from the lives of other pastors that the temptation is always there. Because it's so much easier to just tell people what you know they want to hear. Just tell them what you know they want to hear rather than all of the truth without diluting it, without watering it down. And the New Testament has language for this. It's called tickling ears.